This presentation will review the scoring, administration, and interpretation for CBM reading, and specifically we're going to talk about oral reading fluency and maze. Last week you reviewed the resources that were available through the DIBELS website, Ames website, and also Intervention Central, and I just wanted to point you to some other resources that provide both research on reading CBM and also actual materials that you would use for the assessment, so the reading passages that you would use, the maze probes, handouts with the directions for administration, as well as scoring guides too. So these are all good resources if you get yourself in a position where you will be doing these assessments, where you can generate the probes there instead of creating them yourself. I just wanted to remind you again of those big ideas in beginning reading that we reviewed this week. And today when we talk about reading CBM and maze, we're looking at measures that target the reading fluency and comprehension. And next week we'll talk about early literacy measures, so we'll look at measures that are linked to phonemic awareness and the alphabetic principle. So just as an organizer for this week and then also a preview for next week, here we have our big ideas of literacy and then also our measures. So we talk about phonemic awareness. Next week we'll look at measures of initial sound fluency and phoneme segmentation fluency to measure out the alphabetic principle. Next week we'll learn about measures including nonsense word fluency and letter sound fluency. This week we will focus on the fluency with text, the oral reading fluency, which has traditionally, when we talk about reading CBM, that's what people are talking about, oral reading fluency. We'll also talk about vocabulary. Typically the assessment there has been vocabulary matching, but more importantly we talk about that vocabulary in terms of comprehension, and comprehension is often measured with the maze, and we'll learn about that this week as well. So oral reading fluency is a measure, a curriculum-based measurement, and as we discussed last week, curriculum-based measurement is the most researched and widely supported form of general outcome measurement under the big umbrella of curriculum-based assessment. So again, just as a reminder, general outcome measurement, it's a vital indicator of overall progress in a domain. It's not as directly linked to the curriculum, but it gives us that idea of overall how the student's making progress regardless of the curriculum that we're in. So we talk about oral reading fluency. It's an overall measure of reading performance. It's appropriate for students at the instructional level of first grade and higher. And the goals of using oral reading fluency: make sure students appropriately placed in their curriculum, and then be able to establish what their performance is now and how they're improving. So as a CBM measure, as a CBA measure, it's going to be short, repeatable. We can administer this once a week, every other week, once a month, given the needs of the students. But we will be able to engage in repeated, direct, ongoing assessment of the student's performance. The basic procedures for reading CBM are pretty simple. Basically, the student reads aloud from a grade-based reading passage. They read for 1 minute, and the passages can be from the actual curriculum or just generic grade-level passages. So you do want to make sure that the reading level of the material you're presenting, that you've controlled for that, and you really know that if you're assessing a third grader that it is third grade material. And sample directions, basically you're saying, when I say start, begin reading the passage and try to read each word. If you come across a word you don't know, I'll tell it to you. And you encourage the students to do their best reading and ask them if there are any questions. And sometimes the directions may say something like, it's important for you to understand what you read, so I may ask you some questions later to encourage students or remind them that the focus of reading is comprehension. But this is the typical instructions that we'd give to the student, and then proceed with the assessment. So as the student reads, you record the words read correctly and also the errors that are made. So a word read correctly are correctly pronounced words within the context, and if a student self-corrects the word within 3 seconds, then that's correct as well. Errors include mispronunciations of the word or substituting a different word. If they skip a word, that's an error. If they take 3 seconds, then you count that as an error and you supply the word to them. Transposition, so they swap the order of 2 words. We don't count it as 2 errors. We count it as 1 error as long as they read both words correctly. That's 1 error. If they omit an entire line in the reading, typically what we do is we redirect them and then score that as 1 error. What's important to note is that these are the rules, the traditional CBM reading rules, and you would use these regardless of what reading passage that you select. If you choose to use a system like AimsWeb or Dibbles, then you want to make sure to just review the rules through their administration booklets, which sometimes slightly differ from these traditional rules. Here are some more rules. Okay, what is neither correct or an error are repetitions. So if they repeat the word, you just ignore it. If they have an accent, we don't hold them against them, so that's not counted as an error. Or insertions either. So if they plug in a word that's not there, you just ignore it. Additionally, numbers count as words, and hyphenated words count as 2 if they can stand alone, and abbreviations count as words as well. So when the assessment's all done, what you're reporting are words read correct per minute and also errors per minute. And if the child continues to read for more than a minute, then you want to prorate it here using this formula. But basically, you allow them to read for a minute and then you can say stop. So we use reading CBM to monitor students' progress to see how they're doing, but we can also use it in the form of a survey level assessment to make sure that the student is at the instructional level, so they're not being presented with material that's much too difficult for them and they can't benefit from instruction. So here are the steps to use reading CBM to assess instructional placement, or what they call a survey level assessment. So first, from each book in a reading series, you would take 3 passages, and those passages would be between 150 and 200 words. So when we talk about in a reading series, we're talking about at a grade level. So if we have a student that's at the 3rd grade level, but we're not sure that they're actually reading at the 3rd grade level, we might start there. So I'd take 3 passages from the 3rd grade book that's being used for reading instruction. One from the beginning of the book, one in the middle, and one at the end, and I would check the readability to make sure that it's appropriate. If it's not within half a grade level, I'd throw it out. I want to make sure that these are really at the grade level I'm trying to assess. And I would go through my regular procedures we just described. I'd have the student read aloud for 1 minute for each of those passages. Then I would take those scores and I would select the median score, so the middle score, and I would compare that to data that are out there suggesting what the instructional level is, the frustrational level, and determine if they are at the instructional level or if it's too difficult or if it's too easy. So if it turns out the student's not at the instructional level, but it's actually at the frustrational level, then I go down a level. So then I grab my 2nd grade book, and again, I take 3 passages, have the student read aloud for 1 minute from each of those, take the median score, and again, compare to those published instructional, frustrational, or mastery level guidelines. And I would keep going up and down reading levels until I find the student's instructional level. And that is the place in the curriculum where the student's likely to be challenged but can make progress. There are lots of different ways we can interpret our reading fluency data, our reading CBM. So one way is by comparing the student's performance to empirical benchmarks. So these are research-based data points, and they indicate the minimum level students need to achieve to be on track for literacy outcomes. And Dibbles does have some published benchmarks for the elementary grades. So you would know if the students were meeting those benchmarks, they were on track for reading. We could also compare students' performance to local or national norms, and we're going to talk about these more in week 10. But basically, local norms is we look at the performance of students in this school or this school district, and we can take those student scores and come up with our percentile rankings and compare how the student we assessed is performing in terms of that. And typically we look at about the 25th percentile during winter or spring to be the instructional level. So if our students performing lower than that, then they're not where they need to be. If they're performing over the 75th percentile, then they've kind of mastered where they are and could move on to more difficult material. We can also do the same thing with national norms. And the Ames Web, if you subscribe to their system, what they have are aggregated norms. So they collect the data from all the students in the schools that subscribe to their system, and they pool that data, and they've come up with what the 25th percentile is, the 50th percentile. So you could compare your students' performance to those percentiles. And we're going to talk much more in week 10 about kind of the strengths and limitations to using local norms versus national norms versus even benchmarks. In addition, in your Shapiro text, there's some historical data that give an idea about instructional frustrational mastery levels published by Fuchs and Dino. And those data are still fairly good guidelines for, identifying when the curriculum might be too challenging, when the reading material is too difficult for a student. And we're going to use data to establish our short and long-term goals. So we'll look to see where, if our student is below the instructional level, where do we need to get them so they can be on track with grade level material. And we'll get that through the use of empirical benchmarks as well as local and national norms. Just as we reviewed the importance of establishing inter-observer agreement when you're doing direct observations, when you're observing a student's academic performance, we also want to establish agreement here. So that's through inter-score agreement. And basically, you would have two people score the same assessment at the same time. And the formula here is we do agreements divided by agreements plus disagreements times 100. And this would be most accurate if you compare word by word. So both people say, yes, they read the first word correctly, second word correctly, third word correctly. We both agree that they read the fourth word incorrectly, and so on, to get this degree of agreement. And again, this speaks to the reliability and validity of your assessment results. The Maze reading task is a CBM assessment for reading comprehension. And here the student's given 3 minutes, and it's a multiple choice task. Basically, you have a 150 to 400 word passage, and the first sentence is left alone, but then following that, every 7th word is replaced with 3-word option. And the student's task is to go through the passage, and whenever they are presented with those options, to pick the word that makes the most sense in that passage. And your score is just the number that they respond to correctly. And here again are some sample directions that you'd give to the student. And these can be found as well in your training manual from the Ames Web for Maze reading comprehension. Here's just a sample Maze probe, and I think this is from Ames Web, but as you see, every 7th word following the first sentence includes these 3 choice options, and the student would just circle the one that fits the best. Just like for oral reading fluency, when interpreting Maze data, we can look to local norms or national norms to see how a student is faring in comparison to same age or same grade peers. And we look to between the 25th to 50th percentile to be an indicator of the instructional level. And if they're performing at the 75th percentile or higher, then they've really mastered. For inter-score agreement, we just go through choice by choice and see if both people agreed or disagreed, whether the student got it correct or not. And the important thing is the choice by choice is that if I just go through and I say I have him got that the student answered 9 correctly, and another person says that they also had that the student answered 9 correctly, it could turn out that we had a different 9 that we think the student answered correctly, so we want to make sure it's actually the same 9 items they answered correctly before we report our agreement. So in this presentation, we've gone through what the basic procedures are for reading CBM, oral reading fluency, and Maze, and how you would go about scoring those assessments and interpreting the results using comparisons to empirical benchmarks, local norms, or national norms. Last week, you also looked at the resources that were available through Dibbles or Ames Web, too, to do reading CBM. And I just wanted to reiterate that you don't have to use Dibbles or Ames Web to do reading curriculum-based measurement. So the procedures we've described here you do with any grade level material. You can use the books that the students are using in the classroom. You can get a basal reading series to select passages to assess for oral reading fluency, or to go ahead and create maze assessments. What DIBELS and AimsWeb offer are standardized passages controlling for readability, so you don't have to worry about that. They also provide scoring materials, so you can download administration booklets, or AimsWeb also has computer administration available. They also offer data management systems, so both for pay, school district or a school could choose to sign up for their data management, and they'd be able to enter these scores right in and create the graphs. And then finally, they offer benchmark and normative data, so which you can get without paying or subscribing to their data management systems. So benchmark data are available for DIBELS measures, and then normative data, as I mentioned before, AimsWeb has all of their aggregate norm data from from schools that have signed up for their system, and then you could see the percentile rank for these measures. So again, DIBELS and AimsWeb are systems that have the materials ready to go, but reading CBM can be done if you have a book and you know the grade level of it, then you have the materials you need to do these assessments.